What's your favorite? Boy, that's an open-ended question, isn't it? Because you really don't know what it is, but the truth is, if we define the things in our lives, we could pick out things that were our favorites. Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Burns, and thank you for joining me on Walking with the Word. This is a program designed to take you and to take me and get us into our Bibles and just spend a few minutes together on Mondays together. We're looking at an interesting subject today, and it's a subject that's brought to us by you. You have went to our website, you filled out the survey tab, and thus today we are studying a lesson that is brought to this program by your opinion. Walking with the Word, your favorite verses. This is part 2. We've done one of these before. We have 3 verses to look at today. They're all fantastic. Here they are. Number 1, He came to Himself. Number 2, take heed to yourself. And number 3, I will cry unto you. We have 3 verses, and here's the first one. It comes from Luke 15. So go ahead and grab your Bible, get a pen and paper, and let's walk through some things together so that we can learn more together in thinking about the Scriptures. This is someone's, hopefully it's your, favorite verse. Luke 15, verse 17. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? It's in this occasion we learn about a young man who's talking to himself. You ever done that? I myself am one who talks to himself, and I reason with myself. If you come by the office at the Finley building, you might find me maybe thinking I'm on a phone call. No, I'm just talking to myself. I'm working through something. Maybe I'm working through a passage and trying to figure out what it means, or maybe I'm working on something technical. Today I was working on some microphones that I'm going to use overseas, and I was working through how some of those things needed to work. But here's a young man who to himself, he reasoned, he came to himself. He has this conversation in his own mind about what others have. He said, how many of my father's hired servants? He thought back to where he used to be. You see, in Luke 15, verse 2, we learn about this young man, and he told his father, Luke 15:12, correct it, he told his father, give me all this money, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to live. And Luke 15:14, he has spent all of these things. He's wasted his father's inheritance. He's wasted what he had. And then he has this epiphany moment. He comes to himself. He brings himself to this conversation in his mind, and he says, how many of them have it better than I do? The servants. He was the son of the father. And he says, and I perish with hunger. Now, what's interesting to me about this is, after this thought, after this out loud statement, he said to himself, he goes home, and he rehearses what he's going to say. I've sinned before you and before the God of heaven. He said, I'm not worthy to be called your son. But yet the father receives him into the house and puts a new robe on him, shoes on his feet, ring on his finger. And they made a great party together. And in Luke 15:24, they began to be merry. Why? Because what was lost is found. What was lost is found. Now, the most interesting part about this to me is we have this young man, and we read about what he's going through and what he's experiencing here in verse 17. But down in verse 31, really 30 and 31, the older brother, it seems, he's upset about this party. And I've worked and I've done everything you said, Father, and I've been here the whole time, and I've never forsaken you. And we probably understand that a little bit in our own lives, a little bit maybe. And his father tells him, you've been with me the whole time. You're always with me. He says, but now what was lost is found. Oh, there were so many attitudes here in this scenes, and really 3 attitudes I want you to take away from Luke 15:17. The father trained the son. The son rehearsed that training. He said to himself, how many of my father's house have it better? I'm perishing with hunger. And then the older son, he still heeds the advice of his father. You see, you've picked this out, and what we learn is, here's a man who came to himself. Maybe you and I, we need to be people who come to ourselves. Maybe we need to have that moment where we talk to ourselves and say, I'm going to do what's right. I think Luke 15:17 is a great verse to pick as your favorite verse. Here's the second, and it comes with this phrase, take heed to yourself. It's in 1 Timothy 4:16. Take heed to yourself and to the doctrine. Continue in them. For in doing this you will save both yourself and those who hear you. It's important to remember something about this passage. It's 1 Timothy 4:16 in specific, but remember that this is a letter written by Paul to Timothy. It's the first of two that we have recorded. And Paul is writing to Timothy of all things about ministry. And in other places, he tells Timothy, make full proof of your ministry. Don't neglect the things that you're supposed to do. It's really what I would call an encouraging letter to Timothy. Keep up the good work. Keep fighting the fight. Keep the faith. Stay with the Lord. That's the presence of this letter. And as we think about this, we have a man who has been in ministry, Paul, training up or mentoring a young man, a younger man. He was about in his 30s, early 30s to mid 30s. And he's telling Timothy, here's how you can do great. And of those things, Paul tells Timothy something he needs to remember, and it's something you and I need to remember, not only for preachers, but for Christians. Take heed to yourself. We'll pause there and think about that. Take heed to yourself. It's really easy to look at somebody else, to see how they've went wrong, to see what they could have done, to see what they might do. It's real hard to look at self and say, I need to be right with the Lord. I need to do what's right. What's right really matters. That's hard. That's difficult. And that's what Paul tells Timothy to do here. He says, take heed to yourself. And then he says this, and to the doctrine, the teachings of which Timothy had learned. Many, I would suggest to you, by Paul, were very important. Take heed to yourself and to doctrine. And then notice this, continue in them. Why? For in doing this, in taking heed, paying attention to doctrine, continuing in these things, you will save both yourself and those who hear you. This is a fantastic verse, and why it's fantastic is those who are being saved, they need to hear the saving message of the gospel. Take heed to yourself, Timothy, live right, and to doctrine. Pay attention to doctrine. What you teach matters, and continue in them. Why? Because the words you give, Timothy, can save others. It's not that Paul, it's not that Timothy, they were the authors of salvation. Hebrews 5:8 and 9 tells us that Jesus is the author of eternal salvation. However, we can read from the author and we can give those words to mankind today. Just as Paul encouraged Timothy, we need to be encouraged to, number one, know the good news. To number two, take care of the good news in our lives. And number three, share the good news. I want to challenge you today in doing something. I want you to invite somebody to church. Just walk up to them and say, it's real simple and easy. Words are easy, aren't they? I'd like you to come with me to church. Sit by me. We'll spend the time together and we'll go out to lunch. You see, sharing does not mean you're doing the preaching at all times, but it means you're inviting someone into your life. In this occasion, he tells us, take heed to yourself. Why? Because salvation is near to all. Take heed. Take heed to yourself. Here's number three. I will cry to you. Now, I want to admit this first. Men don't like to cry. We don't like to be emotional creatures. Matter of fact, we love to be logical creatures. It's what we might say is our strong suit. Something that we feel that we're good at. Getting the facts, making the decision, moving forward. Now, that's not to say that emotions are evil, emotions are wrong. It's not to say that others are emotional and that's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. But men don't like to cry. But there's something the psalmist said that I think we really need to pay attention to. It's Psalm 61, 1 through 3. Hear my cry, O God. Attend to my prayer. From the end of the earth I will cry to you. when my heart is overwhelmed. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for you have been a shelter for me, a strong tower from the enemy. I love the psalmist here, and this psalm in Psalm 61 is credited to David. And David, if you think about him in his life, he was a man of might. He was a man of wisdom and of valor. He was a man of riches and greatness. But here he says, I'm going to cry to you, O God, not necessarily in tears, but in pleading. I would suggest to you that this does include tears. The emotion is in the context of this passage. I'm going to cry to you, and I'm going to do so with my prayer. How do we communicate with God? With prayer. He says, from the ends of the earth, wherever I go, I'm going to spend time in prayer. And here's why he says he's going to spend time in prayer. He says, when my heart is overwhelmed. It doesn't mean that he's always overwhelmed, but it does mean that at some point in time in life, he's overwhelmed. His life is hard, it's difficult, and we understand something about that, don't we? We understand problems and issues and factors. He says, when I'm overwhelmed, I'm going to come to you. Why? Because you can lead me to the rock that's greater than I. He says, God, you can take me to something that's better than me. He said, because I can cry to you. I can bring myself to you, and you have been a shelter for me, a strong tower from the enemy. It doesn't say God's going to take away the enemy. It says, in the midst of trouble, in the midst of problems, you have given me peace. Peace is a calm heart, a stilled heart in trouble. And we can access peace when we spend time seeking after God, seeking after Him, going for Him, looking into Him. And I love this of Psalms. He says, attend to my prayer. Why? Because I will cry to you. I'm going to give you another challenge. I didn't mean to give you two, but here's a second challenge for you today. Spend some time today in prayer. At a time you would not normally spend time in prayer. And just spend time praying about those things that overwhelm you, those things that bring you confrontation, those things that bring you anxiety and fears and worries and troubles. And know that God is strong. Know that God cares. That's what the psalmist was trying to tell us. You see, there are a number of passages we can look up. We know that he came to himself in the book of Luke. Paul told Timothy to take heed to himself and doctrine and to continue in them. And the psalmist tells us that prayer, we can cry out unto God. What a blessing it is to know that inside the Bible, we can read about Bible verses and put them into their context and know what they mean. That's what we try to do with this program, is be people who walk with the Word every day of our lives.